My name is Daniel, and I still remember the exact sound my uncle made the day I told my family I was dropping out of college. It wasn't shouting. It wasn't even anger. It was laughter. A short, sharp laugh, the kind you give when someone tells a joke that isn't funny, followed by silence so heavy you could hear the refrigerator humming in the kitchen behind him. "You're quitting college," he said, "to build websites in your bedroom." He wasn't asking. He was announcing it to the table, like a verdict. My mother looked down at her plate. My father said nothing, which was worse than anything he could have said. And my cousin, sitting across from me in his pressed shirt and his fresh MBA acceptance letter, still sitting on the kitchen counter where everyone could see it, smiled the kind of smile that told me he'd already decided who the winner of this family was. 7 years later, I stood outside a 15-story glass building in the middle of the financial district, watching a construction crew mount a sign above the entrance. My uncle's company had leased the top 3 floors. There was going to be a ribbon-cutting ceremony. Press, champagne, a photo op for the local business journal. He didn't know the building had a new owner. He didn't know that owner was me. And in about 6 weeks, he was going to find out in front of every single person he'd ever bragged to about how his nephew never amounted to anything. This is the story of how I got there, and how the loudest laugh in my family became the quietest silence I've ever heard. To understand why that laugh cut so deep, you have to understand my family. We weren't rich. My father worked in logistics, moving freight for a shipping company for almost 30 years. My mother did the books for a small dental practice. We lived in a decent house in a decent neighborhood, and the unspoken rule in our family was simple. You go to college, you get a stable job, and you do not take risks. Risk was a dirty word in our house. Risk was what irresponsible people did. My uncle, my father's older brother, was the family's measuring stick. He'd built a mid-sized consulting firm over 20 years, the kind of business that wasn't flashy, but paid well and looked respectable on paper. Every family gathering became, in some quiet way, a performance review. Whose kids were doing what? Whose kids had which degree? Whose kids were on track? I was never on track. I was the kid who took apart the family computer at age 11 just to see how it worked, and then spent 3 days rebuilding it because I was too proud to admit I'd broken it. I was the kid who taught myself to code from library books before anyone in my school even offered a computer science class. By the time I was 17, I was already building small websites for local businesses, charging $50 a project because I didn't know my own worth yet. None of that counted, in my family's eyes. What counted was the acceptance letter. What counted was the major on the transcript. I enrolled in a business program because it was the safest thing that could still be called practical, and I hated almost every single day of it. By my second year, I was spending more hours building a small piece of software, a scheduling tool for local barbershops and salons, than I was spending on my coursework. It started as a side project. Then a few shop owners in town started paying for it. Then a few more. Then a developer friend told me the idea had real legs if I actually gave it my full attention instead of doing it at 2 a.m. between assignments. I made the decision the way most life-changing decisions get made, quietly, alone, terrified, and completely certain at the same time. I was going to leave school and build this thing for real. I just had to tell my family first. And I had no idea how badly that dinner was going to go. I chose a Sunday dinner because Sunday dinners were sacred in our house. Everyone would be there. I told myself if I could say it in front of everyone at once, I wouldn't be able to talk myself out of it later. I wanted witnesses to my own commitment. I didn't realize I was about to give them witnesses to something else entirely. I waited until the plates were mostly empty, until the conversation had drifted into the usual rhythm of family small talk, and then I said it as plainly as I could. I'm withdrawing from school this semester. I want to focus full-time on the scheduling software. I already have paying customers. I think this could actually go somewhere. For a second, nobody said anything. Then my uncle laughed. It wasn't a big laugh. It didn't need to be. It was short, almost polite, the kind of laugh that says I've heard this before, and I already know how it ends. You're quitting college, he repeated, to build websites in your bedroom. I tried to explain. I told them about the revenue, small as it was. I told them I had a plan, a real one, with numbers and projections. My uncle cut me off before I finished the sentence. Everyone has a plan when they're 20, he said. I had plans too. You know what separates a plan from a fantasy? Consistency, discipline, not throwing away a degree because some barbershop owner paid you for a website. My father still hadn't said a word. I looked at him, waiting, hoping he'd say something, anything in my defense. He finally spoke, and his voice was quiet in a way that hurt more than shouting would have. You're embarrassing yourself, Daniel, and you're embarrassing us. That sentence stayed with me longer than the laugh did. My cousin didn't say much either. He didn't need to. He just glanced at his MBA acceptance letter on the counter, then back at me, and let the silence do the talking. I left the table that night without finishing my food. Nobody stopped me. Withdrawing from school wasn't dramatic on paper. I filled out a form. I met with an academic advisor who asked me twice if I was sure. I signed where she told me to sign, and that was it. The dramatic part happened everywhere else. My father stopped introducing me to people the way he used to. Where he once said, "This is my son, he's studying business," he started saying nothing at all, letting silence answer questions he didn't want to answer. My mother tried to stay neutral, but neutral in our family meant staying quiet, and staying quiet meant I felt like I was disappearing a little more every week I stayed home. My uncle told the story of my dropout at every family gathering for the next year. Not cruelly, exactly. He never raised his voice. He just brought it up the way you'd bring up the weather, a small aside dropped into conversation to remind everyone where I stood. Still building your little website thing, Daniel? He'd ask, and I'd say yes, and he'd nod like he'd confirmed something he already believed. I moved out 6 months later. Not because anyone told me to leave, but because I couldn't sit at that table anymore and be the cautionary tale at my own family dinner. I rented a single room above a laundromat, the cheapest place I could find, and split my days between customer support calls for the barbershop scheduling tool and writing code until 2 or 3 in the morning. Money was tight in a way that's hard to explain unless you've lived it. There were months I ate the same $5 meal every single day because it was the only thing that fit the budget. There were nights I genuinely wondered if my uncle was right, if I really was just an overconfident kid who'd thrown away a stable future for a fantasy. But every time that doubt crept in, I thought about the sound of that laugh, and something in me refused to let that laugh be the last word. The scheduling software found its footing slower than I wanted, but it found it. A regional chain of salons signed on. Then a competitor to that chain, worried about being left behind, signed on too. I hired my first employee, a college dropout like me, working out of a shared desk in a co-working space that smelled like burnt coffee and ambition. I want to be honest with you. It wasn't a straight line up. There were 2 years where growth completely stalled, and I nearly shut the whole thing down to take a stable job just to breathe again. There was a stretch where a larger competitor tried to copy our features and undercut our pricing, and for 3 months I thought we were finished. What kept us alive wasn't some genius insight. It was stubbornness, and it was listening closely to customers who felt like the big companies had stopped caring about them. We built the kind of support and reliability that a company our size couldn't fake, because we didn't have the luxury of faking it. By year 3, we'd expanded past scheduling into a full business management platform for small service businesses, salons, barbershops, spas, small clinics. By year 4, we'd raised a modest round of funding, enough to move into a real office and hire a real team. By year 5, a much larger company in the same space approached us about acquiring the platform outright. I said no. Not because the offer was bad, it wasn't, but because I finally understood what I was building was worth more running independently than being absorbed into something bigger. That decision alone, made quietly in a conference room with 2 advisors and a lawyer, is the moment I actually started calling myself a founder instead of a guy with a side project. None of this made it back to my family. I hadn't spoken to my uncle in almost 2 years. My father and I exchange short, careful phone calls a few times a year, the kind where neither person says what they actually mean. As far as my extended family knew, I was still the cautionary tale from that Sunday dinner. I let them believe it. There was something almost peaceful about being underestimated. Nobody watches you closely when they've already decided you're not worth watching. The building came into the picture almost by accident. My company had outgrown our office space, and a commercial real estate broker mentioned an older 15-story building downtown that was undervalued, poorly managed, but sitting in a location that was about to become extremely desirable once a new transit line opened 2 blocks away. My finance team ran the numbers. It wasn't just a good office move, it was a genuinely smart investment. We could occupy several floors ourselves and lease out the rest. We closed on the building in the spring. I didn't think twice about it beyond the financial logic until my leasing director came to me a few months later with a list of tenants who had signed letters of intent for the upper floors. One name on that list stopped me cold. My uncle's consulting firm. Apparently, his company had been searching for a new headquarters that would reflect their growth. His words, according to the leasing memo, and this building fit the image he wanted. He had no idea who owned it. Commercial leases like this rarely reveal ownership directly to the tenant. It goes through management companies, holding entities, layers of paperwork that most tenants never bother to look past. For a moment, I genuinely considered quietly killing the deal, redirecting him somewhere else, avoiding the whole situation entirely. It would have been easy. Nobody would have known. But then I thought about that Sunday dinner. I thought about the laugh. I thought about, "You're embarrassing yourself, Daniel." And I realized I didn't want to avoid this. I wanted to let it happen exactly as it was unfolding and be standing there when it did. I told my leasing team to proceed with the deal, under the holding company's name, no mention of me anywhere in the paperwork. My uncle signed a 10-year lease for the top 3 floors of a building he had no idea I owned. The building management scheduled a ribbon-cutting and grand opening celebration for the new tenants, a fairly standard event for a building this size, press invited, local business leaders in attendance. My uncle, ever the showman, decided to use the event to announce his firm's next chapter to the business community. I made sure I would be there, quietly, not as a guest, as the owner. The morning of the event, I stood in the building's management office on the 2nd floor, watching the lobby fill up through the security monitors. String lights, a small stage, a banner with my uncle's company logo stretched across the back wall. He was there early, shaking hands, laughing his usual polite laugh with people who mattered to him. My father was there too. I hadn't expected that. He stood near the back, uncomfortable in a suit that looked a size too formal for him, clearly there out of family obligation rather than genuine excitement. I hadn't told him I would be present. I hadn't told anyone. The building's general manager opened the ceremony with the usual remarks, thanking tenants, thanking the construction team, thanking the neighborhood association. Then he said the words I'd been waiting months to hear. "And now, I'd like to introduce the building's ownership group, represented today by the company's founder and principal owner." He said my name. I watched my uncle's face from the side of the stage before I even stepped forward. For a second, he assumed it was a coincidence, a different Daniel maybe, or a mistake in the program. Then I walked out from behind the curtain, and I watched the exact moment recognition hit him. His mouth opened slightly. No laugh came out this time. I kept my remarks short and professional, thanking the tenants for choosing the building, mentioning a few details about renovations planned for the coming year, the kind of things an owner is supposed to say at an event like this. I didn't look at him the entire time I spoke, not out of spite, but because I genuinely didn't need to anymore. The moment had already said everything it needed to say. After the ceremony, as the crowd mingled with champagne and small talk, my uncle approached me. Up close, without an audience, his composure cracked a little more. "You own this building," he said. It wasn't really a question. "I do," I said. "Congratulations on the new office. I hope the space works well for your team." He studied me for a long moment. searching, I think, for the version of me he'd decided existed 7 years ago at that dinner table. The kid building websites in his bedroom. The embarrassment. The cautionary tale. He didn't find that version of me. Because that version of me hadn't existed for a very long time. We spoke for maybe 10 minutes, off to the side of the lobby, away from the noise of the reception. He didn't apologize, not directly. People like my uncle rarely do, not because they lack the capacity for regret, but because admitting fault out loud has never been part of how they move through the world. What he did instead was ask questions. How did I build it? How long did it take? Whether I'd raised outside money or bootstrapped it myself. Practical questions, the kind of questions a businessman asks when he's trying to understand something that doesn't fit his existing model of the world. I answered honestly, without bitterness, though I won't pretend there wasn't a quiet satisfaction sitting underneath every answer I gave. At one point, he said something I didn't expect. I didn't think you had it in you to stick with anything difficult. I told him the truth. You didn't think I had it in me because the version of sticking with something you understood only looked like one shape. A degree, a title, a ladder someone else built. I stuck with something. It just didn't look like your version of discipline. He didn't have a response to that. For the first time in my life, my uncle was the one sitting in silence at the end of a conversation. My father found me a few minutes later, near the exit. He looked at me the way I imagine he'd wanted to look at me at that dinner table years earlier, but hadn't let himself. I should have said something back then, he said quietly. I let him talk, and I let it be enough. I'm sorry, Daniel. It wasn't a grand reconciliation. There was no music swelling in the background, no tearful embrace in front of the reception crowd. It was just two people, finally saying the thing that should have been said years earlier, in a lobby full of strangers who had no idea what they were witnessing. In the weeks after the event, word traveled through the family the way it always does, quietly, through phone calls and comments dropped into unrelated conversations. My cousin, the one with the MBA acceptance letter on the counter that night, reached out to congratulate me. I appreciated it, even though I noticed he hadn't reached out once in the 7 years before that lobby moment made it impossible to ignore. My uncle's company stayed in the building. We never spoke about that Sunday dinner directly, not once, not even years later. Some wounds in families don't get resolved with an apology. They just get quietly buried under enough new evidence that the old story stops being true. I won't tell you I did all of this purely for the business logic, because that would be a lie. Part of me wanted exactly what happened in that lobby. Part of me had imagined some version of that moment for years. Late at night, during the hardest stretches when quitting would have been so much easier than continuing. But here's what I actually learned, sitting with it long after the champagne glasses were cleared away and the banner came down. The laugh at that dinner table never had power over my future. It only ever had power over how loudly I doubted myself in private. My uncle's opinion of me didn't determine what I was capable of building. It only determined how long I let his voice live in my head before I stopped listening to it. The real revenge wasn't the building, or the ceremony, or the silence on his face when he heard my name announced. The real revenge was simply refusing to let a room full of people who doubted me decide what I was allowed to become. If there's a lesson in this story, it's not that success is the best revenge, even though it certainly felt that way standing on that stage. It's that the people who laugh loudest at your beginning rarely stick around long enough to witness your middle. They see the risk. They see the uncertainty. They almost never see the years of work that turn a bedroom project into something real. Don't build your life to prove someone wrong. Build it because you refuse to let their laugh be the last thing you remember about that table. Because one day, if you keep going, they won't be laughing anymore. They'll just be standing quietly in your lobby, finally seeing what you were building the entire time. I want to tell you that the story ended in that lobby, with a quiet apology from my father and a stunned silence from my uncle. For a while I thought it had. But real life doesn't close its chapters that neatly, and about 8 months after the ribbon cutting, I found out just how unfinished this story still was. It started with a phone call from my leasing director, the same woman who'd handled the letter of intent for my uncle's firm. She told me, in the careful tone people use when they know they're about to hand you something complicated, that my uncle's company had missed their last 2 lease payments. I didn't feel triumphant when she told me. I want to be honest about that, because it would be easy to tell this story as a clean, satisfying arc where the villain gets exactly what he deserves and the hero watches from a safe distance, arms crossed. That's not what it felt like. It felt heavy. It felt like watching a slow-motion accident you have no obligation to stop, but can't quite look away from either. I asked her what was happening with the account, purely from an ownership standpoint, nothing personal. She explained that his firm had lost 2 of their largest long-term clients within a few months of each other, one to a merger, one to an internal restructuring that cut consulting budgets across the board. Cash flow had tightened fast. The kind of consulting business my uncle ran, built on long relationships and steady retainer contracts, doesn't have much room to maneuver when 2 or 3 of those relationships disappear at once. I didn't reach out to him directly. Some instinct told me it wasn't my place, not yet, and maybe not ever. But my father called me a week later, and I could hear in his voice that he already knew. "Your uncle's company is struggling," he said. "Did you know?" "I heard something," I said carefully. There was a pause on the line, the kind where you can feel someone deciding whether to say the next thing out loud. "He's proud, Daniel. He's not going to ask you for anything. But I think you should know that pride is the only thing standing between him and going under." I didn't say much in response. I told my father I appreciated him telling me, and we left it there. For a few weeks, I sat with the information and did nothing. Part of me told myself this wasn't my responsibility. My uncle had built his own path, made his own choices, said his own words at that dinner table years earlier. If his business struggled, that had nothing to do with me. I was simply his landlord. Landlords don't rescue struggling tenants out of sentiment. But another part of me, quieter and harder to ignore, kept circling back to something my father had said in that lobby. I let him talk, and I let it be enough. I didn't want to become someone who let silence be enough, in the other direction this time. There's a difference between refusing to be someone's doormat and refusing to be someone's opportunity for a lesson in humility they never asked for. I asked my leasing team to draft a modified lease structure for my uncle's firm. Not a bailout, not charity, but a genuinely fair restructuring. A temporary reduction in square footage paired with a longer lease term. The kind of deal any struggling tenant with a decent payment history might reasonably be offered. It made financial sense for the building regardless of who the tenant was. That mattered to me. I didn't want this to be a favor. I wanted it to be a legitimate business decision that happened to also help him. I had my leasing director present the offer through the normal channels, no mention of my personal involvement beyond what he already knew. 2 days later, he called me directly for the first time since the ribbon cutting. "I know this came from you," he said. No preamble, no small talk. "It came from the building," I said. "It's a fair deal regardless of who's on the other side of it." There was a long pause. I could hear him breathing, the way people do when they're working through something they don't have practiced words for. "I owe you an apology," he finally said. "Not for the lease, for a lot longer than that." We met in person a week later, at a small coffee shop near the building, deliberately away from any office, away from any audience. No stage, no reception crowd, just 2 people at a small table, the kind of setting where it's much harder to hide behind performance. He told me things I hadn't expected to hear. He told me that when I was 20, dropping out of school terrified him in a way that had almost nothing to do with me, and almost everything to do with his own history. His father, my grandfather, had drilled into him from a young age that stability was the only form of safety a person could count on. That risk was a luxury reserved for people who had a financial cushion to fall back on if things went wrong. My uncle had spent his whole adult life building exactly the kind of stability his father demanded, and when I walked away from the path he'd been taught to protect, it didn't feel like watching a nephew make a mistake. It felt like watching someone casually discard the only thing he'd been taught mattered. "That's not an excuse," he said. It's just the truth about where the laugh came from. I wasn't laughing at you, not really. I was laughing at the version of myself that never had the nerve to take that kind of risk, dressed up as concern for you. I didn't respond right away. 7 years of accumulated resentment doesn't dissolve because someone finally explains themselves clearly at a coffee shop table. But something in his voice was different than it had been at that dinner, or even in the lobby after the ceremony. There was no performance left in it, just a tired honesty that felt, for the first time in my life, like actually talking to my uncle instead of being talked at by him. I'm not going to pretend the last 7 years didn't happen, I told him. But I don't need you to keep apologizing for one dinner. I need you to actually see me now, not as a cautionary tale you got wrong, and not as some symbol of revenge either. Just as your nephew who happened to build something real. He nodded slowly. I can do that, he said, and for once I believed him. A few months after that coffee shop conversation, my father and I were driving back from a family gathering, the first one in years where the air in the room hadn't felt like it was measuring me against some invisible standard. My uncle had actually asked me questions about the business that night, real questions, not the probing, skeptical kind from before, but genuine curiosity. It was a small thing. It mattered more than it should have. In the car, my father was quiet for a while before he spoke. You know, he said, I used to think the lesson here was that you proved him wrong. That's what I told myself for years, quietly, whenever I felt guilty about that dinner. My son proved his uncle wrong. It felt like a tidy way to make peace with my own silence back then. And now? I asked. Now I think the real lesson was smaller than that, and honestly more important. You didn't need anyone's permission to become who you became. Not his, not mine. That's the part I got wrong at that table. I thought staying quiet was neutral. It wasn't. Silence took a side that night, and it wasn't yours. I didn't have a perfect response to that, so I just let it sit in the car with us for a while. The kind of comfortable silence that finally didn't feel like disappearing. People ask me sometimes, usually after they've heard some version of this story secondhand, whether I regret giving my uncle that lease restructuring. Whether I should have let his company struggle, let the world balance its own scales without my help. I don't regret it. Not because I'm particularly generous, and not because I'd fully forgiven him the moment I offered it. I did it because I refused to let his mistake 7 years earlier turn into a mistake of my own. He built an identity around control and stability because he was taught that was the only safe way to move through the world. I built an identity around risk and quiet persistence because somewhere along the way, I stopped needing his definition of safety to feel like I mattered. The building still stands where it always has, downtown, glass catching the morning light, his firm's name still on the directory in the lobby, 3 floors up from where mine sits. Some mornings I still think about that Sunday dinner when I walk through that lobby. The laugh, the silence from my father, the MBA letter on the counter. But mostly now, I think about the coffee shop table and the quiet conversation in the car and how much longer it takes to build a family back than it takes to build a company. The company took 7 years. The family is still, even now, a work in progress. If you're sitting somewhere tonight, doubted by the people who are supposed to believe in you first, I won't tell you that revenge is the answer, even though it might feel like it in the moment. I'll tell you what I wish someone had told me at that dinner table. Their laugh is not a verdict. It's just a sound they made because they didn't yet understand what you were building. Keep building anyway. Let the sign on the building say what you never needed to argue out loud.